Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here because we are unpacking one of the most consequential financial puzzles of our time. Today, we're diving into a real masterclass in macroeconomics from the prominent economist Dr. Steve Hanke. We're going to break down his incredibly fascinating insights into the US Treasury's latest maneuvers in the bond market. And trust me, the mechanics happening behind the scenes right now, they affect literally everything, from the global economy all the way down to your own wallet. So here's the massive central question we're exploring today. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently announced a huge market intervention. But can the U.S. government actually control a bond market that is upward of $30 trillion in size? Are they really the masters of the financial universe, or are they, just kind of losing their grip?
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The intervention. 2. Three forces pushing yields. 3. Global trust. 4. The $40 trillion debt. And finally, 5. The solution.
Starting off with Section 1, the bond market intervention, where we'll look at Operation Twist and yield curve control. Right now, Washington is actively trying to put a ceiling on long-term bond yields, specifically those 10-year and 30-year Treasury bonds. They do this through a strategy generically known as Operation Twist. Basically, the Treasury buys back long-term bonds. This artificially manipulates the price upward, which in turn brings the yield, or the interest rate, down. Now, you might be wondering, why should I care about that? Well, because the 10-year Treasury yield is the benchmark for the entire economy. Your mortgage rates, your credit card interest rates, they're all directly geared off this single number. So there is a massive political incentive to keep these rates as low as humanly possible. But pulling this off? It's an incredible balancing act. On one hand, they have to buy long-term bonds to drive those yields down, but because the government runs such a massive deficit, they have to finance it somehow, right? So on the other hand, they issue massive amounts of short-term Treasury bills, which drives short-term yields up. They are actively twisting the yield curve. But Dr. Hanke points out a glaring contradiction here. For this manipulation to actually work long-term, you'd need a contracting money supply. But right now, the broad measure of the U.S. money supply is actually growing. And that friction brings us straight to Section 2, three forces pushing yields, and exactly why this intervention is facing so much pushback. Dr. Hanke identifies three absolutely powerful macroeconomic forces pushing against the Treasury's efforts. These forces basically guarantee that yields are going to keep facing upward pressure no matter what the government tries to do. We're talking about money supply, AI borrowing, and geopolitics. Let's break them down one by one. Force number 1, the money supply. A broad, comprehensive measure of the money supply, it's known as Division M4, is currently growing at an annualized rate of about 6.7%. As Dr. Hanke explains, if you have a substantial increase in the money supply, eventually, usually with a bit of a lag, you are going to get an increase in inflation, and bond yields inevitably follow inflation. Because the money supply is growing so rapidly, Dr. Hanke asserts that the inflation genie is, well, totally out of the bottle. And that fundamentally contradicts the Treasury's whole goal of keeping bond yields down. Now, let's look at the second force, because this one is truly wild. AI capital expenditures. Right now, tech giants like Google and Meta are investing so heavily in these massive AI data centers that their enormous cash flows aren't even enough to cover the costs. So what do? They go straight into the credit market to borrow huge sums of money. This means the AI investment boom is actively competing with the US government for the exact same pool of capital. When demand for credit spikes like this, the price of borrowing goes up. Simple supply and demand. And this brilliantly illustrates our third force, the awakening of the bond vigilantes. These are powerful investors who essentially act as the market's disciplinarians. According to Dr. Hanke, these vigilantes have officially come out of hibernation. They are deeply nervous about the predictable, massive fiscal deficits and just the general interventionist economic policies we're seeing right now. Because they perceive a higher risk, they are demanding higher yields to compensate for it, actively pushing back against Secretary Bessent's attempts to cap the market. That perceived risk leads us right into Section 3. Geopolitics and global trust, and the addition of the risk premium. International conflicts, like the war in Iran, are huge disruptors. Dr. Hanke notes that once you enter a conflict, the administration basically becomes a captive of events completely out of its control. In the eyes of the bond market, this unpredictability creates a severe lack of confidence. Investors see a geopolitical landscape that's totally devoid of traditional guardrails, and to buy U.S. debt in that kind of environment, they require what's known as a risk premium. They literally need to be paid more just to absorb that level of uncertainty.
Now, you probably hear loud buzzwords thrown around a lot, like total de-dollarization. Well, Dr. Hanke clarifies that is largely a myth. The total usage of the dollar around the world remains robust. However, what we are seeing is an undeniable shift at the margins. Foreign nations and central banks, especially those feeling alienated or wary of unpredictable foreign policies, are starting to substitute some of their dollar reserves with gold. It's a proportional shift, sure, but it signals a slight and vital pivot away from total reliance on Washington.
All of these mechanics are unfolding against a staggering backdrop, which brings us to Section 4, the $40 trillion debt, and what crossing this threshold actually means for us. Look at that number, $40 trillion. We are crossing a monumental debt threshold. Now, some politicians might brush it off and say it's just a number, but Dr. Hanke argues that at this sheer size, the debt transforms from a simple statistic into a hard economic constraint. You have two choices. You either have to service this debt or default on it. And the reality of servicing that debt is pretty alarming. To put this into perspective, currently 35% of all personal income tax revenues collected by the federal government goes to one thing and one thing only: paying the interest on the national debt. The Congressional Budget Office projects that if nothing changes, this is going to rise to 50%. I mean, really think about that. Half of your income tax wouldn't go toward roads or schools or defense or any services at all. You get absolutely nothing for it. It just goes straight to bondholders. This is exactly the kind of spiral that has the Treasury scrambling.
So you might be thinking, well, couldn't the US just default? Actually, no. As Dr. Hanke points out, a technical default, like we've seen historically in places like Argentina or Greece, is literally prohibited by the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. It would be unconstitutional. Since they can't technically default, the real risk is that the government resorts to a nominal default. That essentially means printing more money and inflating the debt away, which would cause prices for everyday goods to soar even further. So, what on earth can be done? This takes us to our final section, fixing the debt crisis. Is there actually a way out of this structural mess?
To figure out a solution, we kind of have to look at the track record of failure here. And this is a deeply bipartisan issue. It has been 30 years since Congress passed its appropriation bills on time. 30 years. They simply run on continuing resolutions, totally failing to adhere to responsible budgeting. And we saw in 2020 exactly what happens when the Federal Reserve steps in to monetize this deficit by printing money. We got 9.1% inflation. History clearly shows that ordinary statutory fixes like the Gramm-Rudman Act back in the 1980s, they just don't work. Politicians simply abandon the rules the second things get tough.
Because Congress and the White House have proven structurally incapable of policing themselves, Dr. Hanke presents one ultimate conclusion. He argues that the only genuine solution left is to invoke Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution and convene a narrowly focused constitutional convention. The goal? To embed a strict debt brake directly into the Constitution itself, making it fundamentally, legally impossible for the government to continue running these runaway deficits.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly pressing question. Will a constitutional debt brake actually happen before the pressures on the bond market finally explode? The forces of inflation, AI capital demand, and geopolitical risk, they are relentless. And the math of a $40 trillion debt is totally unforgiving. It's an unbelievable macroeconomic balancing act, and it's one we are going to be watching very, very closely. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this helped you visualize exactly what's at stake in the U.S. bond market. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.